Danielle Durchslag, and here we are today at About 12 Paper Masters. So Danielle, can you tell me a little bit about your practice as an artist and your use of paper? I remember when I first visited you in your studio that you had along the wall all these different types of paper. I don't think I've ever seen so many different types. So I'd love you to talk a little bit more about how central the material is in your work.
Absolutely. Well, I am an obsessive and joyous paper collector, as you know. And I use papers ranging all the way from simple construction paper, the kind we use in sort of elementary school classrooms, all the way through to like one-off handmade Nepalese kind of papers. And a lot of my practice is about collecting the material. And I use, in a sense, very simple materials, paper, tape, and glue, and some vintage board, as you can see here. But what I love is getting as much range as I can in the papers, both in terms of their tone and texture, and then pushing them to do things they might not inherently realize they can do as a material, right? And as you saw in my studio, a lot of it is sort of building up these piles of papers that are very close in tone, so I can create the kinds of subtle ranges that you see in the pieces.
We can see immediately that these are photographs, and we're questioning, are they photographs of family? Are they real photographs, or are they made completely of paper?
They can look photographic, even close up, but they're actually constructed, all of them, out of paper, tape, and glue. There is no photo material in the final object. And these are all portraits of people I know I'm related to, but we no longer know who they are. So it's called the Relative Unknown series for that reason. They're people I'm grateful to. They're partly responsible for my being alive, for the life I have right now, but they're entirely anonymous. A lot of families have this sort of bin of the forgotten, like my family did when I was growing up, who sort of sit under cabinets or maybe under beds. And as a child, I always saved these images because even though we didn't know who they were, it felt cruel or somehow unreasonable to just get rid of them. If you look at the settings that they're in, you can see that some of them are quite specific to the era of the photograph. So we have clues through the photo setting about who they were or when they lived. And occasionally, like here, you can see someone, in this case my father, has actually written "don't know," right? So someone's gone through these images and said, we don't know who these people are, but I'm sort of reclaiming them through this paper process.
Are you essentially inviting us to speculate and make our own stories?
I think all photographic image invites you to speculate. That's part of the joy of going through a bin of photos in a vintage shop, right? And that kind of projection isn't even something that I have to consciously welcome the viewer to do. I see it every time people look at this work. Like, for example, if we can look at this lovely gentleman, I'm convinced that this is his first American portrait. He's come from Europe, he's gotten the American suit and the American tie, and here he goes, he's claiming it. I said that in front of a group of art collectors, and one of them said to me, "You couldn't be more wrong." You know, he's a scientist of the German school. I mean, he had an entire narrative for who this gentleman was that was different from mine, and we could both be correct. Part of why I'm drawn to these images is that they're so specific in how they detail a person's appearance, but they're so general too, because anyone can project a narrative onto them.
And I remember we talked about you viewing that Slash Paper Under the Knife show at the Mad Museum, and that being a seminal show and an influence on your work.
It changed my life. I walked in predominantly a painter with some photographic background, and I left that show and thought I should be making objects out of paper. It took me about 6 months or so of experimenting in the studio to come up with this particular approach at creating something out of paper, but that show was entirely central to the way I've made now for years. It's an honor, quite honestly, to be showing with some of the very artists whose work inspired me in that exhibition. Definitely two of the seminal ones were Adam Fowler and Beube, whose work is standing right before us. For me, that's a remarkable privilege to be showing quite literally across the room from some of the people who inspired me. I think there's a real kind of conversation throughout the show about paper as a medium and how much it can be pushed in several directions, right? Like my work is sort of a paper excavation in a way. I'm making new objects, but it's excavating old souls. And I see other pieces in the exhibition where paper becomes something totally new and startling and radical that you would never think paper could do. So I think there's a lot of range in the show, honoring paper and the various sort of capabilities that it has. My pieces are just sort of one element of that. But I will say, I had the privilege of hearing Thomas Witte talk about his work, and I was almost startled at the parallels in terms of how we thought about paper, our relationship with paper and the studio. And the show has started those discourses between artists, I think, not just between our work.
When people talk about the renaissance in cut paper, particularly in the contemporary field, have you noticed that in terms of people being interested in you and your work?
Absolutely, and I think there's a real core human reason for that, which is that anyone who's been through a schooling system, I hope, I pray, has had an art class at some point, and chances are that class involved paper. Who does not touch paper? Even in this highly digital age, paper is a must. It's a fundamental part of our day. And for artists to take something that's simple, that accessible, and turn it into something hopefully magnificent, surprising, dynamic, I think is wonderfully accessible. You know, Chris downstairs, when I got to hear him give a tour of the exhibition, he said as a gallerist, for him, if a plumber coming in off the street says, wow, he knows a piece has made it. And I think there's a reason why he's attracted to paper artists, because we all have some of that, right? We're using a material everyone identifies with, everyone touches in their day, and we're showing them that art can take that material and propel it to an even higher, different plane, right? So I think it makes sense that there's a sort of new jazzy excitement about it, particularly because it is so tangible. Looking around this floor, the floor beneath us, you can literally see the traces of the artist's hand. And we're in a time where everything is so digitized. I think there's something delicious and nostalgic and wonderful about being able to see how the artist makes work. These are all made with an X-Acto knife, and so is everything else in the room. It's pretty remarkable.
This is Thomas Witte. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your work and your practice as an artist?
I was primarily a stencil artist, and I was using the cut paper stencils to print the artwork on various types of surfaces, found materials, glass and wood and things like that. But there was always interest in the stencil itself, the paper cut. And it was really, I went to a show in October of Dylan Graham, who's also in this show. And after going to that, I went and I said, I really need to just be focusing on the paper cut itself and putting all the detail and all the color and everything in a single cut layer and using that as the artwork. Paper cuts are sandwiched in between two pieces of glass and then floated above a background color, and that creates a lot of shadow and stuff that you really can't even anticipate until you get it into this setting where it's lit in a particular way. Paper cuts are very sculptural in that they're it's such a physical practice, you know, and just from talking to other artists in this show, we all experience that same sort of feeling. You're building this image, you know, and you're cutting something away, and it's that physical practice, I think, makes it very sculptural. When I use older photographs, I think there's like a very natural thing that occurs when people view it, and they automatically implant their own story onto it, or their family story onto it, and they react to it based on their own history or seeing photographs like this that they've stumbled upon in their own. There's something really personal about these ones because they're my family photographs, and I think that's why people react, is because there's a familiarity with that. But then the photographs that I take myself, I feel like I get to implant the narrative.
Do you think that your process is essentially a comment on the fact that digital technology is having such a huge influence on artists today?
I don't think that I'm shying away from it for any other reason than practical, because I get a sharper, clearer picture from a transparency than I would from a digital image. The saturation is much more rich, and I just prefer it. And it's something I wasn't familiar with before I discovered these slides, and so now it's so much part of my life, and that's interesting because it's becoming more and more scarce. It's harder for me to buy slides, it's harder for me to get slides developed, and it's much more expensive now than it used to be, where it was such a common thing. So it was the digital of this era, and he was shooting sort of in a digital fashion, shooting every single scene. And so that's why I'm getting this and this. Like, this was literally him moving and changing his position and taking two pictures of the exact same scene. What's amazing about this show and about this medium is how vastly different each artist is from the next. And I think that's just so comforting to know that you can be in this art world and working with the same material as somebody else and get such completely different results.
Do you resist the category of being called a paper cut artist?
You know, I've gotten mixed reactions when people ask me, you know, when I say, oh, I'm an artist, and they say, well, what type of work do you do? And I say, like, you know, paper cut. And it seems funny because people aren't necessarily that familiar with that type of artwork. It's the work that I make, and it's what I love to do, and I love seeing the final product.
This work is called Forest, and it's by the artist Dylan Graham. Dylan Graham was born in New Zealand, but he's based in Amsterdam. And this is an important work. It's a comment about war, and essentially the unknown individual that in times gone by has been forced to go into battle, often possibly against his own wishes. From far away, you see it as a very decorative picture, and it's not really until you get up close and you can see what's going on. You see that there's definitely a darkness there. You have here some soldiers who are pointing, and they're hidden in the forest, and they're pointing towards these men here who are innocently going about their daily work. These are lines that people put into the trees as they waited to go into battle. And I think historically it's an image that we've seen quite a lot in painting, sort of European landscape picture depicting war. Historical references are important to his work, but he's not telling us and dictating to us exactly where he stands on that. It's, again, the viewer's own opportunity to make what they will of the narrative that's put in front of them. This is Chris Gilmour's work, and this piece is St. George and the Dragon. I first saw a version of this work in a show called Slash Paper Under the Knife at the Museum of Arts and Design. I was completely blown away by it. I couldn't really get past the fact that this is made up of entirely cardboard paper, and yet there is so much drama and authenticity about the tale that is being told here. Here is this wonderful, delicate piece by a Japanese paper cut artist called Hina Aoyama. This is a Baudelaire poem, and she has painstakingly cut the poem out with a pair of scissors. This is Hina Aoyama's first time exhibiting in New York City, and she comes from a long tradition of paper cutting in her family, and in Japan she's done a number of shows and curated a number of exhibitions around cut paper. One of the wonderful aspects to this show is that we've been extremely lucky to work with some fabulous book art. This is a book artwork by Laramée. It's called Mount Fuji, and it's a Japanese dictionary. And the artist has hand-sawn this extraordinary Mount Fuji. These bookworks have really shot him to fame in the last year or so. Interestingly, many people have caught on to his work through the internet. There's been a recent resurgence of interest in the book, and perhaps this is a response to the impact of digital technology on our daily lives. These bookworks are quite often covered, and the artists specifically asked for this show that they weren't covered up, so people are really able to look in, almost touch them, and you can feel this very tactile material that they're working with. This is Brian Dettmer's work, and it's called Standard American. And this is made up of a number of American instructed encyclopedias. Picked the pictures that he wanted to cut out, cut those pictures, yet at the same time concertinaed and worked into the rest of the book. So you get this wonderful fan feeling. This piece is particularly interesting because it is made up of books that were originally instructive, and this idea of layering the images reminds us of filtering and layering and interpreting information. This is the second piece by Laramée, and it's called La Grande Larousse. He has taken a number of encyclopedias that have been discarded and were going to be thrown away, and he's sawn into them fantastic, magical Chinese landscape. And they invite the viewer to come in, to look around, to walk around the piece and really take in this extraordinary work of art before them. An important aspect to this exhibition is fun and having a playful aspect to the works. And I think that's particularly relevant with Pablo Lehmann's work, because he's touching deliberately on very important philosophical and obviously intelligent texts. He's based in Argentina, and he's been working for a long time with these extraordinary, fabulously detailed text works. This is called Philosophical Extracts, and it's based on a text by Nietzsche. However, the artist deliberately turns the text on its head. He cuts out words so that while we're drawn into them and we're trying to see sense in the language that he's written, we can't really comprehend the text that we see before us. They're very beautiful works. They're almost like lace. The reflection on these pieces are just absolutely incredible. They're extremely delicate. This is Jaq Belcher, and we're here today at A Cut Above, 12 Paper Masters.
When I first moved to New York City from Australia, my main concern when beginning to work creatively was to have a minimal process. And so I wanted to work reductively, so remove the matter from the paper. And really the choice of paper was just because it was the most simple medium that I could come up with. And that's how it began. Also, I'd just been in India watching them do japa, where they write the name of a god or whatever mantra over and over again, so I wanted to work repetitively, and so this reductive process was born. But mostly it's about the manipulation of matter, and so really, you know, I'm calling them drawings, but I number the cuts, and this is so that we can have like a dialogue on the energy that created the piece.
For me, what I absolutely adore about your work is that depending on the light, where it is in the day, these works change all the time. And for me, they feel like they're living. And as you talk about this energy, like, that's a very interesting point.
That's a delightful accident, and it is to live with them. It's every hour they shift, but I have nothing to do with that, which is fabulous. Working with a white sheet of paper, the first thing that became evident to me was the spectrum of white light could be seen in. And again, like the shadow, I have no control. You know, often they're seen in these gallery situations, but I prefer them in natural light. And again, every hour they are a different piece. I think we're really diverse here. I think I'm probably the more abstract with Adam Fowler. I like being amongst the diversity. I've not shown with the majority of these people before, which is really super nice. Really, these are like the remains of a ritual, and they actually do have a grand narrative, but of course it's not evident in the piece, but they have notes that go alongside of it. I'm exploring scale at the moment. I'm working on a 14-piece commission, 14-foot commission. It's the largest I've ever worked, the largest sheet of paper. The most intense cutting. Each form has 6 cuts to it, and so it's very labor intensive. And also installation, where I'm working with the remains from these sheets of paper and working on the floor. Geometry is something that came to light after I began practicing like this. The form that I cut is the Vesica Pisces, the intersection of 2 circles. It's known as the geometry for light, but also the symbol for the goddess and numerous other references. To me, in the beginning, it was the easiest form to cut. Like a circle was too hard. Then I have underdrawings. I'm really working more with different geometric underdrawings. This one, for example, is concentric circles radiating out in the scale of 13. And there's also a spiral overlaid and cut into it in a different type of cut. So the spiral is done with 4 cuts to each form, whereas the field is 2 cuts to each form. I mean, they're marked the day I begin the sheet of paper, the day I begin cutting, the day I complete cutting, and the time often. The number of cuts, this is 5,071 cuts to create this piece. And then the final date is the day that I raise it up. And most of the pieces have the numbers of the counting on the back of them.
This wonderful, huge, immense paper mobile is hand cut by an artist called Zoe Bradley. She's a designer as well, and she's based in the East End of London. An important aspect to this exhibition was to show, where possible, a broad selection of artists working within this field of cut paper. And Zoe's work was an important aspect to this show because she's really dealing with the paper here as if it's fabric. Interestingly, she graduated from Middlesex University in the UK and then went on to work with important fashion designers, including Alexander McQueen. And you can really see her using the paper here as material, where you get this bold white that's set alongside this beautiful buttoned piece here, which looks like a fantastic piece of silk. It's monumental, it's beautifully colourful, you can walk around it, people react very strongly to it. And it's very interesting to see paper on this kind of scale where she's really using it dramatically and sculpturally, and it really shows you what can be done with cut paper. So it's my pleasure to introduce Adam Fowler, and here we are at the Cut Above in front of this wonderful work.
I had always been drawing, and as an experiment I cut a drawing out, which was probably in 2002 or 3 maybe, and since then I haven't done anything except for cutting the drawings. It gives me something that I would never be able to get, and it's just opened up this whole new world, and I feel like it gives the line much more gravitas, and the compositions are stronger. And
people are really drawn to the sculptural quality of your work, and I think they're just so in awe of your process. And what's interesting to me is that you seem to be dealing with a very fast process, which is drawing, if I understand it, and then you're taking a long time with the X-Acto knife cutting that out.
The fast approach to drawing is maybe, well, at least for me, a very honest approach. And so I guess there is a nice relationship, or maybe struggle even, between the fast gestural line and the methodically cut process. But for this drawing, the physical laying the graphite down is probably 5 minutes, but the cutting process is so long that it gives me a much better relationship with the piece, and I feel like it gives me a much better idea of how to approach the next pieces. And these pieces are 2 layers, 3 layers of drawings, but I've done pieces that are 20, 30, 40, up to 88 layers, and so it gets really intense to do the drawings and then spend months cutting them out and not really knowing what I'm going to get. But it's, I guess, a leap of faith that I take with that process. But it's, I love the cutting. The drawing is very stressful and intimidating, but the cutting is very meditative and enjoyable. I have experimented with other things, but there's a truth that happens with this that I feel like I can't get any other way, and I think a lot of that has to do with the not knowing aspect of the process and the meditative qualities.
It's my pleasure to introduce Jaq Belcher, who is an instrumental part of putting this show together. Doug has worked with the Christopher Henry Gallery for a couple of years, and he was very generous giving us his knowledge of other artists working within this field of cut paper and book art. So Doug, can you tell me a little bit more about your sort of long history of working with the book?
The piece is called Masked Vocabulary or Masked Words. I do a number of them, so it's not just one particular piece. I'm interested in pushing the idea as far as I possibly can. And this came about from some other work that I did in the early 90s. And what it's about, it's this idea of turning a dictionary inside out, as if we're turning our words inside out, as if we're looking at a piece that, if we don't really know what we're speaking about, it's like we're masking our words. But we know that a mask can also be used to reveal as well as to hide. So I literally turn the piece inside out, and then I discover how to put it onto a stand by very carefully making this armature. And I'm referencing the mask as a portrait, the way one would see, say, a portrait of a Roman sculpture in the Metropolitan Museum, which gave me this idea about putting it in this configuration. Now, the white part on it's like a hairpiece or a wig. And it's about gender in a sense that if I take the hairpiece off, then you don't know if it's male or female. And if I put the hairpiece on, again, it's the same thing. But it's this idea of talking off the top of your head and words coming out of the top of your head. So that's how this kind of developed. And the edges I actually burned on a scroll, not a scroll saw. I do use a scroll saw, but this particular piece I used a band saw. And then it's held together with a piece of wood in the mouth, and I wanted that sort of sense of speaking words or speaking tongues, etc. But it's this idea of eco-cover. We're recovering something that essentially thousands of these have been put together, but they end up in landfills for the most part, or they become redundant because we have our computers. And so how many times now do we actually consult a dictionary as opposed to going to spell check, either in our mail system or our Microsoft Word system or whatever system we're using. So I see it as a sense of revisiting the theme of recycling So the book, in a sense, is redundant, but also it's never going to be redundant. There's a whole other issue about it makes millions of dollars, billions of dollars for publishers, so they don't want to very quickly get rid of the object or the codex.
And what's been interesting to me about working with artists like yourself and the Laramée is that the internet is playing a very crucial role in disseminating your work, and there's been a huge sort of popular interest, and also the sense that the internet is enabling you to reach a fantastically wide audience. How important do you think the role of digital media is in terms of...
Well, there are two aspects to the digital sort of age or revolution in a sense. The first is the internet allows me to get out to a broader public, and by word of mouth or by a book that I recently published, but also the sense of it's a broader audience. It's a phenomenon that's taking place, and what the phenomenon is, it's a sense of we still care about books. You know, we have a very impersonal mechanism for transferring and transforming information, which is the internet and the computer. At the same time, people still love the fact of holding that book in their hand. There's a sense of there's control over the pagination or the turning of the page. You know, it's antithetical to the sense of it being virtual. I mean, a book is an object. It's an object in the world. It has a history of hundreds of years that is very prominent today. That's one aspect of how the internet has influenced my work. The other aspect is when I think about what a hypertext is. Now, hypertext, as we know, is just, it's a link. You have a word and it's linked to another word. And what I do is when I cut the books, whether it's this mask configuration or another configuration, it has to do with, you can actually look at the front of the book and the back of the book, and conceptually, the work now interacts with one another. And you can't do that when a book is in a linear read. You know, when we have a novel or something, or we have an idea, you know, we're reading it for its content, and it's a linear type of read. And until we have the whole book actually read in our head, then we can move back and forth and as a sort of a virtual hypertext in our heads. But what I'm interested in is the visual sort of conflict that happens between the front of the book and the back of the book are really, in a sense, dialoguing or having communication if we interact with it at that level. So now if we see the striations, we're actually not able to read the actual text, but we know that there's text behind there. So I feel it's inclusive of the reader. It's not just a piece of entertainment, but I want the reader's imagination to realize, wow, the front of the book and the back of the book are now interacting with one another. And that's a type of hypertext or linkage that wasn't apparent. In some of my other work, that's even more obvious. So.